So we're live from the ACLU National Headquarters in Lower Manhattan. I'm Ben Wizner of the ACLU. I'm joined by my ACLU colleague Chase Strangio, who has represented Chelsea Manning these last several years, and by the journalist Glenn Greenwald, who probably has more than any other journalists been covering Chelsea Manning both as a source and a cause these last 7+ years. So we're going to be talking about developments in this case. Most thrillingly, a week from tomorrow, Chelsea is going to be released from Fort Leavenworth military prison after having already served more time in prison than any other person in the history of this country for providing truthful information to the media. So maybe Chase, since you have been probably more than anyone else in touch with Chelsea during the last weeks and months, give us a sense of how she is this week, this moment.
Yeah, it's sort of amazing that we're sitting here in a world in which Chelsea Manning is going to be leaving prison in 8 days. This is something that was pretty unimaginable to those of us who have been working with her for a long time, and unimaginable to her for a long time. And it's been a sort of incredible few months since the commutation was announced on January 17th. But it's also been a complicated few months for Chelsea. She was informed of the commutation in January and was immediately that same day removed from the general population cell where she had been living for several years, where she had built a life, and was put into a special housing unit, cut off from the world that she had built. And one of the amazing things about Chelsea is her resilience and her ability to find strength and beauty in any circumstances. And so her life was disrupted, and it was disrupted for an incredibly hopeful and joyous reason, but she had to navigate these new circumstances nonetheless. And now we're just a week out, and she's, just preparing for an absolute transformation in her existence. And those of us who care about her are excited to welcome her to the free world and support her in this transition. But it's also, this country doesn't do a good job of supporting people leaving prison. And there are a lot of things she's going to have to navigate in the world. And so our job as her advocates and her friends is to create the conditions of support for her when she gets out so she can survive.
She still has a lot of life to live.
Yeah.
For someone who has, again, served the longest sentence in history for the kind of conduct that she was charged with, she's coming out of prison a young person. How old is Chelsea?
So Chelsea is only 29 years old. She went, into the military as a young person. She was deployed as a young person. She was arrested as a young person, and she is going to be stepping out still before the age of 30. She's never lived in the world as an out trans woman, and so she has a lot of life to live, as you note, and a lot of different things to navigate ahead.
So I should say that we will be happy to answer questions, especially Chase and Glenn, which you can ask either over Twitter or in the ACLU's Facebook page, and they'll be passing them to me. But Glenn, long before you had first spoken to Chelsea Manning, I'm sure many times, on the phone, you knew her primarily as a source. I'm not sure people realize how much the archive of materials that she released to the public through the media is still really relied on, not just by reporters, but by scholars, and has really sort of filled in the foreign policy history of our country.
I think her legacy as one of the most important, noble, and consequential sources of the past at least 5 or 6 decades, going back to Daniel Ellsberg, has been a little bit obscured by the subsequent history of WikiLeaks and the controversy surrounding it. But if you remember back in 2010, 2011, many of the reports that WikiLeaks was able to do as a result of Chelsea Manning's incredibly brave decision to make this information public, those were among the most significant stories in the world. The New York Times executive editor Bill Keller credited some of them with starting the Arab Spring by exposing corruption in the Tunisian government and other governments in the region. There's a very strong argument to make that some of the documents showing extreme and deliberate war crimes on the part of the U.S. military at the exact time that President Obama was trying to extend the war in Iraq prevented the agreement from being reached. So if you look at the legacy of her impact, just at the time, it's hard to find many people with a greater impact as a leaker. And as you said, 7 years later, that archive remains easily one of the most valuable journalistic archives in the world. Every single day, almost, you could pick up an article in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or articles around the world and find discussions of news events that reference rather centrally many of the documents that she released, proving just how newsworthy they were.
And most of what you just said about how vitally consequential this information was didn't really come up in her trial because of an oddity about the way that the Espionage Act, the law that she was charged under, functions. I mean, do you want to say more about that?
Well, this controversy has appeared, of course, in other cases, principally the case of Edward Snowden. They're both very similar in that regard. When people try and encourage Edward Snowden to return to Washington, the kind of tough guy rhetoric they adopt is he should come home and face the music. And if he really believes he did the right thing in leaking these documents, he should go into court and say so. And of course, under the Espionage Act, which is a 1917 law under which both Snowden and lots of other leakers and in a sense Manning was prosecuted, really has this bizarre strict liability that says that if you release classified information without authorization, you are guilty of felonies, and you are not even allowed to go into court and raise the defense, the primary defense, which is, I was justified in releasing this information, the crimes were exposed as a result of these documents, they never should have been concealed in the first place. And so the defense that they taunt Snowden and have taunted Manning to try and make is one that under the law is actually completely prohibited from even uttering in court.
Yeah, Daniel Ellsberg tells an amazing story about this from his own trial, where in a rehearsed moment, his lawyer said to him, Mr. Ellsberg, why did you provide the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times? And the prosecution said, objection. And the judge said, sustained. And that was the end of that conversation. Ellsberg was either lucky or unlucky in being the target of ridiculous misconduct by the Nixon administration, leading to the end of his prosecution. He surely would have been convicted for the same reason that Manning was convicted and Snowden would have been convicted had he gone to court rather than to an airport.
Right, just theoretically on that. I mean, if you're someone inside the government and you find a classified document showing that somebody inside the government at a high level literally ordered the murder of other people, and you take this document and you bring it to the New York Times or to The Intercept or to another media outlet, you are guilty of a violation of the Espionage Act. And the fact that you want to go into court and say, of course in good conscience I revealed this document because it exposed a cold-blooded murder, that defense would be barred and you would be found guilty of the Espionage Act.
We should say, while we're on this subject, that under the text of the Espionage Act, the New York Times might also be found guilty for publishing it. And it's really a tradition of prosecutorial discretion and First Amendment penumbra, maybe, that those prosecutions have never been brought in the history of this country against publishers or news organizations, even though the law might very well allow it. And I bring it up now because we saw just this week in FBI Director Comey's testimony that at very high levels of government there is at least discussion about prosecuting WikiLeaks for their role in publishing the information that we're talking about right now, which sort of you and I have objected to on strong First Amendment grounds, which has resulted in me having to mute a lot of people on Twitter. But say something about
most of whom had already been muted by me, so
That's right.
I didn't have that work. But back in 2010, 2011, the Obama administration really wanted to prosecute WikiLeaks for publishing this cache of information about the State Department in particular. And what they ultimately concluded, and remember the Obama administration was very aggressive about prosecuting sources and prosecuting leaks, what they ultimately concluded, as they said recently, was that there was no way to prosecute WikiLeaks for publishing top secret information without also criminalizing the New York Times and the Guardian and numerous other media outlets that published exactly the same material that WikiLeaks published. And what we're finding now is because WikiLeaks is more unpopular, they're not just hated by Republicans, they're also now hated by Democrats as a result of the election. There's this almost kind of indifference to the dangers that would be posed by prosecuting WikiLeaks, even for the CIA documents they've recently released, because ultimately, as a lot of media outlets are starting to realize, there's no principled way to say that when WikiLeaks publishes and reports on top secret information, that is a felony under the Espionage Act. But when the Washington Post, the New York Times, or NBC News do it, we're not going to prosecute them.
That used to be a good argument before Jeff Sessions was the Attorney General. Right? You could see him watching that and nodding and saying, of course, the New York Times and the Washington Post should be prosecuted for publishing classified information.
It's worth remembering, Alberto Gonzales in 2006 wanted to prosecute the New York Times for revealing the NSA program, and Joe Lieberman, when he called for WikiLeaks to be prosecuted, was once asked, well, how can you prosecute WikiLeaks but not the New York Times? And Lieberman said, you can't. You should prosecute both. Yeah. And that's the game we're playing now, and it's very dangerous.
So, Chase, turning back to you, on the day that Chelsea Manning was sentenced to 35 years in prison, by far the longest sentence for this kind of conduct in the history of the United States, she announced to the world that she was a transgender woman, that her name was Chelsea. When after that did you become involved in her case, and how much progress have you made in representing her through this transition while she's in very difficult conditions in military custody?
Well, I mean, first, just, hearing about, the value of the information that Chelsea disclosed, I think is so important, because so few people remember who she is, remember what information we learned from her, and she's been suffering in horrific conditions of confinement since her arrest in 2010, first in Kuwait, then at Quantico during her court-martial, and then after her sentencing in 2013, when she came out as a trans woman and indicated that she would be seeking medical care for her transition, which even in 2013 was widely accepted by the courts in the United States as being medically necessary treatment, that denial of which would violate the 8th Amendment of the Constitution. Yet the military immediately and publicly took the position that under no circumstances would they be providing Chelsea with any medical care, which was a pretty bold and blatantly unconstitutional position to take, but I think was very much in line with the treatment that she had been receiving in general since her arrest in 2010, and it was pretty remarkable for her to say, I know this about myself, I know that I'm trans. She had told her chain of command. It had been something that she had been suppressing for a lot of her life and been navigating, and felt that she couldn't disclose during her court-martial for risk of it further prejudicing her her ability to receive a fair trial, which the very concept of which is absurd given how the Espionage Act works and how she was prosecuted. But she was sort of holding on to this deep truth about herself and waiting until the day she was looking at decades in prison, going to Leavenworth and being this incredibly polarizing public figure in a penal environment, and being already vulnerable as a very small person. She's, my size. She's 5'4", 100 pounds, going into this maximum security military prison and saying, there's no way I can deny the truth of who I am any longer, and I'm going to take on this additional fight against the government, and she did that very publicly, and had to sort of grapple with the reality of the media response, the reality with the response from within the military, where she was under complete control of them, and sort of take on that fight. I think we started working with her, and I started working with her attorney at the time, David Coombs, that day. I think, Ben, you and I called David Coombs and said, you're going to need some help here. And so from then, in August 2013 until now, I've been working closely with Chelsea, and like everything in her case, she's really the driving force behind the work. She has a vision of justice that is unrelenting and bold, and she was never going to back down, both for herself and for the people that would come after her.
Can we, we're all people who have, had the privilege of talking to Chelsea a fair amount, but not nearly as much as you have. Just tell people what she's like. I think what the challenge here is that, in being a symbol, even if it's a symbol of very positive things like courage, resistance, struggle, you can lose some of the humanity, and I know that she worries about that sometimes. But tell people what she's like. And people ask questions on Facebook and Twitter.
Well, the great thing is that it's not just going to be us who are going to get to know what she's like. And this is, her whole existence has been mediated through other people and through narratives that completely project onto her a coherence that no human being could ever possess. And so she's going to get to be Chelsea in the real world. But she is, I think what people don't realize is she's this incredibly lighthearted, funny person who, has so little bitterness. And I think, Glenn, in your character letter in her commutation, you really sort of captured the essence of Chelsea, which is that, despite all she's been through, she doesn't have resentment even for the people who have been holding her in these horrible conditions for 7 years. I have so much more bitterness about the entire ordeal about her life than she does. And just, as two examples, after the shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, she and I spoke on the phone that Sunday night. The news had come out that Sunday early morning. And so this was a moment where Chelsea was she was so pained by what had happened and reflecting on the violence in her community and her inability to sort of engage and connect and touch other people. I mean, one of the many forms of violence of incarceration is the insistence by our government that people be denied things as human and necessary as touch and connection. And so we had this moment, and she was reflecting on that and all she would want to do as is sort of part of grieving in this collective moment. So she has this deep empathy and this political insight and this desire to connect with other people. And we have those serious conversations. And then we also talk around the Oscars or the Golden Globes and talk about what people are wearing and, how do they look and what would she wear. And so we have, there's a lightheartedness too. And that, she always says, people take me so seriously, but, I want to talk about Taylor Swift and I want to be a millennial. And so she has all of these parts to her, as so many of us do. And
it's funny because I'm always having to defend Glenn the same way.
Yeah.
I'm telling you.
He actually has a couple of other facets to his person.
Yeah.
Now, can I say one thing about Chelsea along the lines of what Chase is saying? Because last week I tweeted saying something like, in 10 days, one of the greatest heroes of our generation, Chelsea Manning, is going to be released from prison. And a lot of people said, oh, look, I kind of am empathetic to Chelsea, but I think that's hyperbole, and started talking about the documents. And for a long time, I was defending Chelsea all over the world as this heroic figure because of the leaks that she chose to do, knowing that she might go to prison, in the belief that the world had a right to know. And then I actually started changing my focus about what makes her so heroic. And it was when I visited her in Fort Leavenworth, and you kind of fly to Kansas City, and then you drive an hour into Kansas, into the middle of nowhere, into a pure military base. And then inside this military base, you find the military brig where she is detained well deep into the recesses of that as well. And in the middle of all of that, you couldn't ask for a more difficult environment. She announced publicly and defiantly and insistently that she was going to pursue her transition in prison, in military prison, which has inspired huge numbers of trans people and LGBTs and other people around the world. And then I finally moved beyond that, and once I spent a lot of time talking to her on the phone, what ultimately became most heroic to me is exactly the personality and the way in which she reacted to this incredibly trying ordeal with this amazing amount of resilience and optimism. And the thing that I cannot wait for is Chelsea Manning is one of the most thoughtful, insightful, interesting thinkers I have ever encountered in my life, aside from the likability. And I just can't wait for the world that has never heard from her over all these years. They've heard a lot about her, but never from her, to start hearing just how extraordinary she really is.
And it's really disarming. It's like you're looking at this person and you're watching them survive so many things and having had a life full of trauma, and yet there's this earnest charm and sense of humor there while being so sophisticated in her intellect. And it's intoxicating, and the world really will get to see that in ways only a few of us have.
So let's take some questions. This is from Ashley Backstrom on Twitter. Is there any risk that the release won't go as scheduled, and what preparations have been made to support Chelsea once she's released in terms of reintegration? This is the order from President Obama, dated January 17th, saying that she's to be released in 120 days. If for any reason this order isn't complied with, there's going to be legal hell to pay. But I think we have every reason to believe that on May 17th, Chelsea is going to be free. And Chase, do you want to say a little bit, without getting into detail, about what preparations have been made? She's not going to be just discharged and told to fend for herself.
No, she is definitely not going to be discharged and told to fend for herself, although it is an absolute disgrace that the majority of people who leave prison are told exactly that. And I think we should just, take a moment to accept and comment on the just absolute injustice of that, of the way in which we treat people in prison and the way in which we release them. Chelsea is not going to be in those circumstances. We have been working incredibly hard over the past 3 months to make sure that her release is safe, that she is safe, and that she has not only the financial resources to access the health care that she needs, to get the support that she needs to live safely and privately, but also that she's given the emotional support that she needs to not have to make any decisions immediately about what her life needs to be, who she needs to be accountable to, other than the systems and things that she wants. So we're incredibly vigilant. We don't take anything for granted, and there will be hell to pay if there are any problems. And the main goals are, to get her the pizza that she wants and the PlayStation that she wants and those little things, and also make sure that she's safe and comfortable.
Okay. Looking for some more questions. One question is, seriously curious, what is the ACLU's involvement with this? Why are we defending her? I think that we've gotten at some of that. But maybe I could just reinforce the point that Glenn was making about the need for whistleblowers in the free press. And I think in this moment, people are or should be more aware of it. We have a president who has demonstrated contempt for democratic norms. We have a Congress that is in the same party of the president and is not doing a whole lot of constitutional oversight. And so without the independent media with access to classified and confidential information from the government, the public is not going to know what the government is doing. And so when the government comes in and imposes a 35-year sentence, when it says that it doesn't matter if your actions were done in the public interest. It doesn't matter if they actually serve the public. We're going to treat this the same as someone who sold our secrets to a foreign enemy. That is a problem of constitutional dimension. I think that on our Facebook page right now, there are links to some resources here. You can see the brief that the ACLU filed in Chelsea's appeal, in which we argued that using the Espionage Act in the way that Glenn explained is unconstitutional in this context, and I think that Chase did a good job explaining why defending Chelsea's dignity and autonomy and right to medical care is absolutely within our values.
And not to mention fighting against the solitary confinement that she was subjected to at Quantico and in Kuwait, and then threatened with further during her incarceration at Leavenworth.
And let me just add as well, if you look at some of the most significant revelations about the Trump administration, not the Obama administration, but the Trump administration, things that have caused scandal, firing of top national security officials like Michael Flynn, a whole bunch of revelations about what's going on in the White House. Those have come from people inside the government leaking classified information, the disclosure of which is illegal. And so all of us have an interest in making sure that that process remains vibrant.
I'm having some tech problems in getting your questions, but please send them along and they will be transmitted. But yeah, I'm going to talk about that for a minute. I mean, one of the things that we've seen in the Trump administration already is an unprecedented amount of leaking that I would imagine most people who are watching this broadcast would support. They want to know when there's a draft of an executive order that says that we're going to reopen black sites and reinstitute enhanced interrogation. And they're glad that the New York Times published that draft on their front page, resulting in that order not actually being issued. So if you want to see reporting like that, you need to understand that reporting depends on a source who is committing a felony every time that happens, and maybe you shouldn't cheer the prosecutions of those sources. I mean, one thing, Glenn, that you have highlighted is how often it's members of the media who are cheering the prosecution of their own sources, whether it's Manning or Snowden, and how perverse that is.
Yeah, I mean, it would be like if you were an authoritarian government and someone said to you, you could have one wish, no matter how unrealistic it would be, what would it be? And they would say, look, I know this could never happen, of course, but if I could have one wish as an authoritarian government, it would be that I, the government, don't have to argue for the prosecution of journalism and the criminalization of sources. Instead, the journalists themselves would take the lead in doing that. And then you would say, look, I gave you one wish, but that's just too unrealistic. I can't actually provide that to you. And yet that's exactly what's happening. Every day there are people who are advocating for theories that would restrict their own press freedom, even though they themselves are journalists.
Well, my favorite is the ones that say, Daniel Ellsberg, what he did was good. Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, what they did, very, very bad. Very, very bad, without any sort of coherent way of explaining what that distinction is.
And even though Ellsberg says, these people did exactly what I did, and it's what I've been waiting for 40 years.
Yeah, I mean, one thing maybe, Chase, that you can talk about. I mean, we should not believe for a second that this order from President Obama was the result only of one president's compassion, although I have enormous gratitude to him for having done this. But this really was the result of a global movement.
Yeah, I mean, it was a global movement that began the day that Chelsea was arrested and that we learned about what was happening to her, because the way to keep Chelsea alive was always to keep her story alive and to make sure that the value of what she did was never forgotten, that the value of her humanity was never lost. And that was the legal strategy in her appeal. That was the legal strategy in our civil case against the Department of Defense. That is a critical part of any major legal strategy, to have a campaign behind it. That's what we're seeing now in our work to challenge the various actions of the Trump administration, particularly right now with the Muslim ban and other executive orders. We can win in the courts, or we can lose in the courts, but if we build the story and build public pressure, that's going to be how we see real change. And the idea of a commutation for Chelsea Manning was so outside the scope of what anyone believed possible for so long, and it was only because so many people, starting with Chelsea herself, were relentless in centering her and her story and making sure that Glenn was out there explaining that the value of the information that she disclosed, that the trans community came around after the LGBT community, quite frankly, abandoned Chelsea during her court-martial, and really said, President Obama, if you care about your legacy on trans rights, this is an action that you have to take. And people were relentless, and that's how we really came to this moment. And Chelsea herself was at the center of it.
Glenn, were you expecting this?
No, I have to say I wasn't.
Yeah.
And it's a little bittersweet because it's hard to separate the happy outcome from the hideous and totally unjust 7 years of persecution and torture and unjust imprisonment that she suffered throughout her entire 20s. That's going to take a while to, I think, recover from. But at the end of the day, I have to give credit to President Obama nonetheless, notwithstanding the fact that he presided over the 7 years of prior injustice, because there was no political benefit to issuing this document at all. There were no constituencies calling for it. It was just somebody inside the government deciding that she had suffered enough.
And there's nothing to be gained when the human rights movement criticizes people for good behavior. Right? I mean, this was good behavior.
It was.
By the president.
Yep,
and I
absolutely.
think really, if he did it for legacy reasons, it is an admirable part of his legacy that on the way out of office, he gave Chelsea Manning a chance to live a life.
Yeah, and I mean, I will say today is May 9th. A year ago today, the Justice Department, the Obama Justice Department, under Loretta Lynch, sued the state of North Carolina for their anti-trans law, and Loretta Lynch got up there and gave an incredibly moving press conference stating how trans women are women, trans men are men, we see you. But at the same time, that same government was blocking Chelsea Manning from having health care in prison, was denying her basic humanity. And I think it was the vigilance of Chelsea herself and trans advocacy in saying, yes, we see an ally in you, federal government right now, but that allyship can't end at the moment of arrest and incarceration. Trans people don't lose their gender when they're arrested. Chelsea Manning is just as much of a woman as the people in North Carolina that you are defending, and I have to give a lot of credit to the community that held our allies to account in the government to not be hypocritical allies, and to appeal to Obama's legacy on that point.
So, Glenn, we have a question from Facebook asking about what other sources whistleblowers can turn to if they don't necessarily have government documents, but they still want to report serious misconduct, and feel free to make a pitch for your own publication here.
Right. Well, I think one of the encouraging developments in the wake of the Trump election is that so many media outlets have now decided that providing safe and anonymous ways for sources to leak information to newspapers is a critical part of protecting a free press, in part because people have realized that the surveillance regime where the government is able to know everybody who's communicating with everybody else can really jeopardize a free press, because how can a source go to a journalist if they're going to be detected that way? But also because of the new threats posed by the Trump presidency, suddenly what had been kind of this fringe practice at the Freedom of the Press Foundation and at The Intercept and a couple other places of having secure drop, of having technology that allows anonymity, is now suddenly all over. And I think it's really strengthened freedom of the press, and it has allowed sources like Chelsea Manning, who maybe 10 years ago only had WikiLeaks and a couple of other available options to leak with the security that she could do so anonymously. Now it's pretty much completely standard in the world of journalism, and I think that's going to
people can go to the website of The Intercept, and there's a link from the front page there saying, if you have information that you want to share confidentially, here's some easy instructions on how you can do it.
Right. With instructions about, nothing's foolproof, right? But there's some really good practices that minimize risk.
So, Chase, this is for you, another question that we got from a viewer. What's next for Chelsea? Do we expect that she's going to continue to work on civil liberties, on whistleblowing issues, or is she in some sense looking forward to a less public life? Or should we let her answer that question with her words and her actions?
Yeah, I mean, I think, finally Chelsea's going to be able to speak to that and make these decisions and let people know sort of what lies ahead. And I know that, she's someone who I don't see being able to ever let go of advocacy or ever let go of the fight for her vision of justice, but certainly she has every right to let go of that if she chooses, and we will be able to take guidance from her finally.
That's definitely my impression, based on my far more limited interactions with her, is just that she's so involved with the issues of the day, and in her own way comfortable being a public voice on these issues too, especially when she has control over that. I would be shocked if she retreated entirely from public view and public life.
And can I just add one thing to that?
Yeah.
One of the things that's most inspiring to me is that the amount of support and love and gratitude for Chelsea Manning is impossible to overstate, not just in the United States, but in Europe and in South America. If I give a speech in Brazil and mention her name, instantly erupts thousands of students and people and a standing ovation. Same with, anywhere in the United States or in Europe. So the amount of public appreciation for what she's done, I've tried to communicate that to her. I'm sure you have as well. But until you actually see it and feel it, the intensity of it, and the campaign that was done to try and raise funds for her to ease her transition was such an overwhelming success. Because the amount of people who regard her as worthy of gratitude and not punishment is extremely large. And I think that's going to really embolden and enable and smooth her transition.
Yeah, and inspire her. I mean, I think, absolutely. We can convey all of these things, but it's very different to sort of hear it mediated from people who you believe to be biased and who are, versus sort of being out in the world and experiencing the love and all of its manifestations, which she will finally, get to do.
Last thoughts?
I mean, I think I would just say, the fact that Chelsea Manning is coming out of prison next week, knock on wood, I think we should all be sort of looking forward to the ability to actually watch and grow and learn from this incredible person who our government responded to by locking away, but who, because of her own determination and the public support around her, is actually going to be able to walk free and continue to sort of transform our thinking.
And Glenn, I'll give you the last word, but before that, I'll just say it means a lot to me to be having this conversation with you, because you and I have been together in our own way working on this set of issues for the last decade, at least, and we haven't had a lot of moments of pure celebration, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And like I said, although before you can find some bittersweet aspect to it, for me, when I was visiting Chelsea, when I was spending all those hours talking to her on the phone about her struggles in prison, the idea that she would be released seemed so remote. It seemed almost impossible. And so to now watch it happen and watch this still young woman have this incredible opportunity in front of her to use her talents, her compassion, her insight, her courage, her conviction. I don't know what she's going to do exactly, but I know it's going to be extraordinary, and I can't wait to watch it. And you're right, it is a cause for pure celebration, one which is very rare in this line of work.
So thanks everybody for watching, but more than that, thanks everybody for support for us, for the work that we're doing at the ACLU, and more than that, for supporting Chelsea, who's been through so much. Signing off.